Good morning, Judson community. It's a great day. Good job. Wow, good job. I do also want to echo and encourage you, if you have not done so, if you have not participated in a global outreach trip, if you've ever thought about traveling with the team of folks and serving others, if you want to understand some of the issues we're going to talk about today in Constitution Day, global outreach is a phenomenal way to do that and to gain a very different perspective on some of the things we'll talk about as it relates to the Constitution of this country by serving others literally around the world. The other part of it, for your own professional and personal development, the contacts you will make will be with you for the rest of your life, professionally and personally. So I want to encourage you, especially you guys, because guys are slow to sign up and put your name on the dotted line, please, please, please consider and sign up for global outreach. So you've got about another day to get that done. I want to encourage you to do that. Let me start with a quote. The heard voice perishes, but the written letter remains. The heard voice perishes, but the written letter remains. Voc audita perit litera scripta manet. It's the Latin phrase. You'll be quizzed on that before you walk out of chapel. But what that basically means is why we codify things, why we put things down in writing is incredibly important. Because history and humans will tend to interpret those things differently unless we have the written letter. This is one of several points on why Scripture and our faith identity as a Christian university and the Constitution have some things in common. Constitution Day, in addition to these other points, is incredibly important to us at Judson University. That is why we're willing to dedicate a chapel to this conversation. Why is it important? Well, if you're a DACA student, if you're a first-generation immigrant to this country, if you're an international student, the Constitution is important to you. The Congress shall have power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Now, how that gets done is left to politics, but the why it should be done is left to the ethical, moral, and value framework of this country. Why are there states? And why are the rights of the citizens of those states important? That's in the Constitution. Article 4, almost in its entirety, but especially Section 4. The free exercise of religion. Article 6, there should be no test for public office. And Amendment 1 in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And just within this past year, both of those perspectives have been challenged by the U.S. Senate and by the Congress to include the application of a religious test for judicial appointees. It's important to you and it's important to me. Our religious freedoms in this country are respected and protected by the founding documents. This is not uncommon. Over 30 countries around the world have adopted language recognizing God and or religious freedom. Yet the Constitution truly is a secular document. And as a Christian university, we recognize three things. The most important governmental or political consideration that we have as a Christian university is the kingship of Jesus Christ. Christ first, and then everything else follows. That's how we lead at Judson. To include the how and the why we participate in civil, secular, governmental structures. God's design, point number 2, is to bring people together in communities. We often refer to these communities as nations or states or republics. Within those communities, God's call to God's people is to be active leaders in those communities, especially as it concerns serving the last, the least, and the lost. It's not just enough to be a part of. We are supposed to be a part of and also apart from. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights ensure that we have this opportunity in this country. It is a document that is clearly influenced by Christian thought at its core, its ethical and its moral and its legal foundation. And even though some secular historians may argue that it's not a religious document and it does not have any religious intention, that would be inaccurate in at least half that statement. Being a part of the Communities of the United States, in Illinois, in Elgin, and at Judson University means that we are shaped by the importance of this document. That is why we should appreciate why it is written down and why we're doing this chapel today. We have no better person to take us through this conversation than Dan Proft. Dan is no stranger to Judson University. He has been a part of our World Leaders Forum program, interviewing individuals that have had leadership roles from literally around the world. Dan is an attorney, a political advocate, a former Republican candidate for governor. He is currently a radio and talk show host with AM 560 The Answer in Chicago. He is also an entrepreneur, and he has interest in web-based and radio content. He is the co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project, a 501c4 organization that promotes free market public policy solutions. He's on numerous boards, and he is an active member of the communities that he has served. It is a pleasure to welcome him back, and would you please give a big round of applause to Dan Proft.
Thank you. It's good to be with you all today on National Cheeseburger Day. It's also an important day. It's an honor to be back at Judson College. Dr. Kroom, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for your attention. So, I think about the Constitution, and I want to pick up on something Dr. Kroom said, which is about its religious inspiration. I mean, the Constitution, as the founding document of our representative republic, stands apart from any country the world has ever seen. It codified something different than has ever been codified, which is that our rights as human beings come from the Almighty and not from government, not from a monarch, not from a politician. Therefore, as enshrined in the Bill of Rights, government is to act as a negative restraint on other regarding behavior, individual action, so as to protect every single one of the natural rights that we have as human beings so that we can all exercise them simultaneously and freely. It's a restraint on infringement. It's not positivistic in the sense that government is to confer this right or this privilege. But I want to take a step back, just sort of establishing that as the foundation, and talk about a few numbers. So there's 3 numbers that I try to use to inform my life and my conduct, and I do so more successfully some days than others, to be sure. Those numbers are 4, 8, and 10. 4, 8, and 10. The 4 cardinal virtues, the 8 beatitudes, and the 10 commandments. And those numbers are not just important to me as a practicing Catholic, they were also important to our founding fathers as Christian gentlemen. Their religious perspective and, importantly, the religious persecution that our founders were fleeing to come to this land inform the founding documents that have guided us more or less effectively for 232 years. 4, 8, and 10. And if anybody wants to test me, I can recite them too. I'm not just throwing out the numbers. And so similarly, I think about numbers that jump out at me with respect to the Constitution. And I think of 3, 5, and 27. So 4, 8, and 10, 3, 5, and 27. The first 3 articles of the Constitution setting up our co-equal branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial in that order. and the 27 amendments to the Constitution, we always haven't got it right. And I'll talk about some seminal cases that highlight that fact. We're fallible men and women, haven't always gotten it right. Sometimes the Constitution needed to be amended so that we were perfecting the Union. And so we've done that over the course of that time. But I want to start with the five freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment. Dr. Kroom talked about one of them, of course, freedom of religion, speech, assembly, press, and petitioning your government for redress. Why is the Constitution important to every single one of you? Because those five freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment, those negative restraints on government enshrined in the Bill of Rights, those moments throughout our nation's history where we've perfected the Union, or more closely perfected the Union, remedying mistakes that were made by one of those co-equal branches or more than one of them. Those times speak to this ever-present tension between competing values, freedom and order. Somebody's rights versus somebody's expectations or feelings. And all of those are playing out in real time. Every discussion that you see on the national political scene is informed in some way, shape, or form by a constitutional principle or a constitutional stricture. And boy, haven't we covered a lot of ground there in the presidency of Donald Trump. It's been a while since people had to familiarize themselves with the 25th Amendment, but you had Democrats making 25th Amendment arguments about the president's capacity to serve as president of the United States, arguing that that was potentially a way to remove this president from office. So removing a president from office is serious business, doesn't really happen very much. And so understanding that provision in the 25th Amendment, those provisions, plural, in the 25th Amendment, that would inform such a discussion. How can you participate in the claim that's being made by one side, the defense that's being offered by another side, about the President of the United States in real time and all the power the President has in modern times in America, if you don't understand the basis of the argument? What's happening on college campuses around the country? It's not just the tension between freedom of religion and mainly claims of discrimination that are being litigated in the courts at every level. It's also the tension between freedom of speech versus the concerns that people have about being hurt by speech that they don't like, speech that they disagree with. So these are real tensions that go back to how do you draw those lines in a free society? What's the basis? If it's just everybody living their truth, if it's just everybody saying, no one is here to judge because your opinion is just your opinion and my opinion is just my opinion and one doesn't supersede the other, then how do you get to anything resembling truth where there's agreement? How do you get to anything that will enjoy the legitimacy of both sides in a disagreement? Well, you have to have some foundation for truth that exists outside of any individual's opinion, right? And so this is where the natural rights informed Constitution is presented, and it should be, is the basis, oftentimes is the basis, sometimes is not the basis, for adjudicating these decisions. What kind of society do you want to live in? You can't answer that question without an understanding of the Constitution. What kind of America do you want to live in? How free do you want it to be? What rights do you have? What responsibilities do you owe? None of those questions can be properly answered without a thorough founding in the Constitution and the ideas that gave this country formation. So think about that. Think about important cases in American history where we've got it wrong. Fallible human beings, fallible men, right? Arguably one of the worst cases, I would argue the worst case the Supreme Court has ever adjudicated was the Dred Scott case, which declared that black people were not citizens for the purposes of our country's population, enfranchisement, voting rights, and the like. It took a civil war and the enactment of the 13th and 14th Amendments to overturn the Dred Scott decision. Co-equal branches of government. The judiciary makes a terrible decision founded on a flaw in our founding documents that was a political compromise to give birth to this nation. And the Congress and the state legislatures come in and remedy that after the fact. 1898, Plessy v. Ferguson, the idea that you could have public institutions be separate but equal. That was the law of the land for 56 years. It gave rise to institutional racism in this country. Racism, de jure racism, racism as a matter of law. Separate but equal, in quotation marks, education. And that was overturned in 1954 by Brown v. Board of Education. So think about half a century where you're living with the consequences of the decision of a Supreme Court that made us a less perfect nation, that made us a nation that was not reflective of the founding values, was not reflective of the idea that we are all equal in the eyes of God, we are all deserving of the same natural rights. And how it took culture change to foment a change from the justices on our nation's highest court. And frankly, now think about 65 years forward and how we're still imperfectly living up to the promise of Brown v. Board of Education, that separate but equal cannot stand. And compare and contrast the quality of education in some of our urban centers, like just south of you in Chicago, to some of the wealthier suburban communities in Chicagoland and elsewhere. Do we really have the same opportunities? Do people in urban centers really have the same opportunities? Or are many people discriminated against based on their household income and their address in places like Chicago and other suburbs? So 60 years after Brown v. Board, 65 years now, we're still not really getting it right. We're better. We're certainly better than we were when we were operating under separate but equal, but we haven't fulfilled the promise of Brown. So that's the other piece of this, right? It's not just remedying a mistake that was made by the legislative branch, not just remedying a mistake made by the judicial branch, not just remedying a mistake made by a president. Then there's the implementation. You can pass laws, you can repeal laws. We had prohibition for 13 years, 18th Amendment. We repealed it with the 21st Amendment. But the cultural changes that must accompany legal changes, or frankly, the cultural changes that must be forerunners to legal changes, are not so easy. And they're going to be driven, for good or for bad, by people who are committed. That's the story of history from time immemorial, isn't it? It's always changed by the committed few, for good or for bad. So those cultural changes that drive legal changes are going to be driven by people who are committed. And what is the basis upon which they bring their commitment? Is it the founding documents? Is it the first principles that inform the founding documents, that informed the Constitution, that informed the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment, that informed our co-equal branches of government, that informed this idea of a representative republic that the world had theretofore never seen? Or is it going to be my feelings, what I feel is right? Truth resides in my head. So whatever I think is right is what I want imposed. There's a real tension here in American culture today because so few people, I think, have a true understanding of our founding documents and the principles that inform the founding documents. As this society becomes more and more secular, that's going to become more and more of a problem. I mean, think about your own social circles and familial circles. Maybe this room is more the exception than the rule, but how many people in your social circles, your friend circles, could recite 5 of the first 10 amendments? Know Article 1 from Article 3? Could name all 5 freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment that inform so much of your life? Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. You don't have those freedoms, your life is very different, isn't it? All you have to do is look at the countries that don't. Look at the countries where government is the repository of rights and privileges and the imposer of responsibilities, mandates. And including in the West, right? People are going to jail in Canada over using the wrong pronouns. There's no First Amendment. And we think of Canada or the UK as, well, they're, hep Western democracies just like us. No, they're not. They're not. How much do people have a real appreciation for the freedoms and the restraint on government? I can't say those words enough. The freedoms and the restraint on government that undergird our free society. Boy, that foundation crumbles and you open up a Pandora's box that you're seeing opened up in some places. There are certainly canaries in the coal mine that are chirping at us. A lot of them are college campuses and what's happening here. A lot of them are those cases before the courts where a baker in Colorado is held up to be a bad person because he's a Christian, or greeting card makers in Arizona, or a florist in Washington State. They're bad people because they're Christians. So who's going to stand with people who are being persecuted and prosecuted for their faith? Is that a serious enough question for you? Your freedom of expression on campus and in every other setting in a free society, the freedom to practice your faith, whatever that may be, without government interference. How do you reconcile those tensions? You want to be respectful of people you disagree with. You want to be respectful of people that are different than you. So how do you think about how to do that and still stay true to who you are and still make sure that everybody's first freedoms are being protected? It's not so easy. It's not so easy if there's no foundation, because then it's just feelings. And as Flannery O'Connor famously said, sentimentality leads to the gas chamber. So these are some interesting times, and the one thing I would caution you about in these discussions, or encourage you to think about, is, people get hot real quick. Be the cooler, not to invoke a Roadhouse-ism. Everybody here is too young to remember Patrick Swayze, I think. But be the cooler. Don't make it about personalities. Make it about the merits of the case. What are the first principles that inform the position you're taking? From what premise are you starting that you drive to this particular conclusion? Help people frame out how they think, because so many people are being so undereducated. You have people who are not particularly cogent at thinking or writing. They're really good at emoting. I remember when we had Condi Rice, when Judson College had Condi Rice for the World Leaders Forum. Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, she's teaching at Stanford. I think she still is. What did she say, Dr. Krum? She said the biggest challenge she has with her students at Stanford, pretty good reputation, biggest challenge she has with her students is they can't write, meaning they can't make out cogent arguments. And sloppy writing is the product of sloppy thinking. I haven't thought through anything. I haven't assessed my position against countervailing opinions. I haven't looked for the evidence that supports my conclusion. I haven't addressed the evidence that would potentially undermine the position I'm taking. I give no consideration to anything except what I feel is right. And then I, vomit that up on the pages. Well, that's the same thing in our political discourse so much of the time. And I mean at the highest levels, but also at the local level too. There's a real underappreciation for all the sacrifices that have been made for all of us in this room. And I'm not just talking about our men and women in the armed forces for the history of our country, but I'm also talking about them. A real underappreciation. There's a real emphasis today on everything that's wrong with America. Real emphasis today that America is one-dimensional, that all we should focus on is America's sins, which, by the way, America's sins, yeah, there are things that bad people did that were terrible. They're human beings' sins. Mortal people, the world over, for hundreds of years, thousands of years, have committed atrocities against one another. Do you want to spend your time endlessly relitigating atrocities over which you can do nothing? Or do you want to say, I recognize those atrocities, I recognize why they were atrocities, I can tell you why they were, I can tell you how those run afoul of the founding principles of our country, I can tell you how they run afoul of the words that are enshrined in our Constitution and our Declaration, and I can tell you what the way forward looks like, because those first principles are as true and important today, and the freedoms they protect as important today as they were 232 years ago. And they provide the bedrock of the greatest country the world has ever seen. Doesn't mean we turn a blind eye to injustices in this country, past and present. You tell the whole story of history, but the whole story, the good, the bad, and the ugly, what we learn from it, what we understand about it, and then reference back to the truth, the godly inspired truth in those documents, and say, always get back to first principles. For me, I go back to where I started. Is how I'm behaving, is what I said or did, is that consistent with the 4 cardinal virtues? Is that consistent with the 8 Beatitudes? Is that consistent with the 10 Commandments? Well, if it's not, then I know I'm not living the truth. And in a socio-political sense, go back to that truth of the Constitution and the Declaration. Is what we're doing, is how society is ordered, are the balances we're making between freedom and order, are they consistent with the first principles? If they're not, then they need to be remedied so that we're consistent with our first principles. And maybe that's something we can do by statute. Maybe we have to have the whole nation come together and do it by amendment, as we've done 27 times. Or maybe we can just do it culturally, that the legal framework is there, the effort, the responsible citizen's effort isn't. I'm very worried about where this country is, and you should be too. About 10 years before the fall of the Roman Republic, the Republic, not the Empire. So this is 17 AD. Roman historian named Livy predicted the fall of the Roman Republic, which happened about a decade later. And he said the Roman Republic would fall because it had become a place where Romans could neither tolerate their vices nor their cures. We can no longer tolerate our vices nor their cures. We couldn't tolerate the bad things we were doing because we knew they were bad. But the killer was we didn't have the will, the courage to cure the vices that we were committing, the bad things we were doing. And I have a sense that in a lot of quarters in this country, that's where we are. We know that we're doing some things that are wrong, that are bad. But you know what? I don't want to upset anybody. I don't want to suffer the slings and arrows of taking a stand. I don't want to be called a name. So, I'm just going to keep my head down and be self-regarding and not so much worry about these fights. Well, I hate to break it to you, but at Judson University here, you have a disproportionate responsibility for the cures to those vices. you're in a position that a small percentage of Americans are in. And with those kind of opportunities comes great responsibility. So the responsibility is to lead on these issues, is to demonstrate the courage that you don't necessarily see exhibited around you, including, and by the way, this is not a millennial comment, including adults from every generation. It's not millennials that broke the intergenerational compact between ancestors and progeny. Real responsibility. What are the first principles that are going to inform the positions you take, the fights that you take up? Where do you find them? Is it worth it? If it is, and I think it is, then, oh, by the way, the time to act is like right now. The time to be an opinion leader within your social circle of influence, it doesn't matter the age group, is right now. Don't let what happened to the Roman Republic happen to our representative republic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. There are so many parts of Dan's comments that parallel a life of faith, the responsibility that we all have for us and how we show up and how we choose to show up. Like we said earlier in the semester, chapel's a gift. It's an opportunity. You choose to be here. You choose to listen. You choose to participate. You choose to find something in what someone shares that will walk out of here with you today. Part of what Dan was sharing in terms of you have a responsibility, I think Chris Lash and the team do a wonderful job of allowing you to find what those nuggets are for you as a part of that process every single time we have chapel. And so, Dan, thank you for adding to that today. We appreciate it a great deal. And give Dan one more round of applause, please. We also want to say thanks to Otto Engineering. Otto has been a big supporter of Judson University. Tom Roser is their CEO. And one of the best compliments that he has ever paid us is a compliment that anyone could share with us. And his comment was, I will always hire a Judson student because I know the quality of which they're from. Meaning you and your background and coming here in the community that you're a part of. And that's probably no higher praise than we can ask for as a university, to have a business leader like that see you as students and say, I want my organization, I want my family, I want people I know to know these students and to be like them. So thanks to Otto, because they support programs like today to help bring guest speakers like Dan to you and to support programs like the World Leaders Forum that's coming up. And I just want to encourage you, if you're a student, you have been given a gift of hearing both Eric Metaxas and Caroline Kennedy talk about global issues on October 8th. And that will take place at the Renaissance in Schaumburg. And as a student, your ticket has been purchased for you. All you need to do is go online or see Julie Schmidt to ensure your seat there. I would encourage you, do not miss that conversation. It is important. On your way out today, you will notice that there will be a couple tables set up, and they'll have this booklet on the Constitution of the United States. I want to encourage you to please pick one up as you leave, as you exit today. For those of you that are in my class, and some of you are sitting out in the audience because I can see you even from up here, this will be relevant tomorrow morning at 8:30. Just a little teaser that I would encourage you to pick it up, read it, and be prepared for why it would be relevant in class tomorrow. A couple of you are already laughing. You probably know what that means. But it is important. So, in closing, let me close chapel with a prayer. And in doing so, I want to put as our context Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, as an 80-year-old and as a member of the Constitutional Convention, and before he passed away, claiming that he was a, quote, thorough deist, end quote, a fiercely independent person in both thought and action. At the Constitutional Convention, Ben Franklin, the least likely of individuals to talk about God and prayer and faith, said these two quotes, quote, that we have not hereto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings, end quote. As he encouraged the other members of the Constitutional Convention to seek the Lord in prayer for the work that they were doing. And then on his personal notes, he scribbled at the bottom of his prayer sheet, lamenting, quote, the convention, except 3 or 4 persons, thought prayers unnecessary, end quote. Even in the midst of the Constitutional Convention, forming the wonderful document that we honor today within the context of our faith identity, even perhaps one of the most deistic individuals sitting there found it necessary to go to the Lord in prayer. It's a powerful testimony. So let me do the same thing by closing our chapel in prayer, and then I will dismiss us. Loving God, thank you for being the inspiration, model, and guide to us and for us, for how we should live as brothers and sisters in the communities you have ordained, blessed, and guided. You are the creator of rights that are given to every person because you have uniquely created each one of us here today. You have made us all differently abled. Help us to honor that by leading our communities in ways that honor you. Thank you for Dan and his message today. May each of us find the meaning for us in what he has shared, whether we are a student, staff, faculty member, or a member of the community that has joined us in chapel today, or individuals listening to this podcast days, weeks, and years to come. Thank you for this wonderful community we call Judson University. May we honor and serve you in all we do and say. Amen. Thank you, Judson. You are dismissed.